Oh,
the grid.
Someday I'd like to
Possible as
travel
well.
again. Maybe I should just pretend I'm traveling and, like put myself in a different Zoom background and say,
Wait a minute.
Oh, really?
You and
That's a
Tommy,
great
you and
idea.
Tommy were traveling recently because I saw pictures.
we
Yeah.
went, we traveled an hour and a half
Yeah.
away to North Georgia.
200 years
it
ago,
looks
that
like
would be
Europe.
200 years ago, that would be a major trip. So you should appreciate that, I think.
True. I am taking you on board there, Alex. Yes, you're right. I might even
can
go to
only
West
travel an
Virginia to
hour.
visit my parents. So that will be a big trip.
Hey, did you
traveled
hike?
an hour? Go ahead.
Yeah, the farthest I can go is like an hour and a half. That's the extent.
So you hit
Did
water.
you and Tommy walk up all the stairs at the Amnacola Falls?
Yes, we did.
That's
Us
quite
and about I don't
deal.
know at an estimate of maybe like 1,300 other people at the same time. It seemed like that's where everybody is. It's too close to Atlanta. Everybody can get there easily. I mean, it was actually quite nice seeing so many people out and about.
Did Tommy do a handstand on top?
He did not. He's having an issue with his thumb. This is what he's telling me anyway. He has this thing in his wrist where if he turns it like he's like doing a peanut butter jar or something, it pops and then he's in like a ton of pain. So he's got to do something ortho. So he's
Horrible.
laying off the handstands for a second.
That's why I don't do handstands as well. It's because of my thumb. Yeah, I just my thumbs is what prevents me from doing handstands. Otherwise,
I'm with you, Jay.
I'd be doing them all the time,
My
Just
wrist
You
just
can
don't
empathize
bend
with
enough.
Tommy.
every morning I'd be like, oh, let me just do. And actually, I don't chin ups because my little fingers really hurt, and so that's why, So I'm with Tommy. I feel the pain.
Yeah, Tommy says, I know I'm old because I hurt myself sleeping. Like I went to bed and then I woke up and I was hurt.
True.
And I don't know what happened. So this is the signs of the end. Like I
With
hurt
Linda,
myself while
Look
I was
at-
sleeping.
Look at Katie's face as we're having this old
I know,
peace
poor Katie.
discussion.
I
She's
know.
like,
She's like,
these.
I feel
Why
great.
am I hanging out with these people?
Yeah, the most boring problem in the world. When we get together and
is
say,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
true.
It's
She
because
can still
Lisa.
do cartwheels and has no pain at all.
Yeah, because Brandy, the key is when I wake up, the over/under's like 3 body parts. So if 3 or less are hurting, it's gonna be a good day. If it's 4 higher, that's gonna be some
bad
Advil
day.
or negotiation.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna take that on board.
Turmeric lattes instead.
Yeah.
I already drink
Ginger.
about 3 turmeric drinks. I have like 3 turmeric drinks a day, like
Yeah.
of various kinds. So
Is there something I'm
it's
missing
not-
here? Is turmeric really good for us?
It's anti-inflammatory. So instead of Advil, you
so
can do turmeric.
Should we snort it?
I mean, you could. It would go into your blood supply through your capillaries, but I wouldn't recommend it. Probably burn a little.
I grade it.
Ingesting it is better.
Ingesting it. All right. That's great.
Good morning, everybody. I just dropped in the chat a link for those of you that are too lazy to just Google Psalm 90. I put the psalm for the day.
We love you.
Yeah. Of course, I put it in the NIV, which I know makes me like default mode pastor, just to go to NIV.
Yeah.
I realize. Are you an ESV guy, Jay?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you're ESV. Katie's a biblical languages, so she doesn't even understand this.
I have
English
ESV though.
ESV.
Oh. 2 to 1.
What do you read, Lisa? Typically.
Well, I just realized the one I picked up this morning was NIV, but a New Living Translation is one that I like sometimes. So,
Brandy,
yeah.
what do you read?
I'm mostly NASB because I like the word for word translation.
Oh, that's really good.
Oh, yeah.
Have you tried the Children's International Bible? It's fantastic.
I even like that. Or the Action
I
Bible.
love it. It's really
Yeah.
good. It's really good.
Children's International.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, it's so good.
I think that I think we have a few linguistic experts that join the conversation. They may or may not are in the chat, but I'm curious about, even if you just look at English, how many years does it take for any translation probably to start to miss being a good conduit to the text because the English language changes and the way we kind of use words? I'm curious about, is it 10 years? Is it 50 years? So if somebody in the chat, somebody on today has a thought about that, I'd be curious about, you follow what I'm saying? Like, just because our language is always changing, our access to what's before becomes problematic. And by the way, and I think it might have been a George Knight class I had in seminary, or a John Pauline class, where there was discussion about reading late 19th century, early 20th century material, like in our tradition, most of us here, like the writing of Ellen White, that really it needs translation because language has moved so far in that period of time, or it needs to have more critical analysis with the lens of, which to me is really fascinating. And that there's actually, I remember one of those courses, there was a conversation about how there's a window of time where it's actually really difficult to properly access a text because it's kind of in that adolescent period, if you will. It's not old enough to be so far back that we understand that we need to interpret it as something of a different language, but it's young enough that it kind of hedges. Does that make sense? Like, it's kind of an interesting question, I think. Anyway.
Well, especially if you think about literature, like we make kids read Shakespeare, and things. I think about, like, I don't have my students reading a translation of John Locke, and 2 treatises and things that are like classic things that they're supposed, that we think are help make you educated. And I'm just sitting here thinking, why don't we? And what would be gained or lost in that? And, that's an interesting, like, I'm not entirely sure about that. And also, I think there was a time, and I think this is true when we think about Christian work in the early centuries, and then also when we think about the Protestant Reformation and in the English language, when we think about the English Bibles, that the scriptures were themselves, and the use of them and the way they'd been translated or the way they were being used was shaping the language rather than the other way around.
Oh, interesting.
So, like, there's a different, like, so if the community is steeped in a particular translation, then that text is shaping, like we talk about how Shakespeare shaped English and our turns of phrase, and the same thing with the King James Bible, like that. So it's a little different, I think, when now those are not canon texts. At what point do we start translating Harry Potter, for instance, for a new generation, or as opposed to, like, these are the ways that we all we understood it, and it shaped us because we were all reading those together.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah. I've often thought about that.
Translate Friends.
Friends.
Timeless.
Or we could just burn certain things.
Yeah, we just move on from some stuff.
No, it's interesting, and I'm gonna allow another couple minutes before I allow for myself. I'm gonna. The other thing that's really interesting to me is if you read, like, Ellen White Age or E.M. Bounds or some of the sermons from that period, say 150 years ago, everything's hyperbole. Always do this. Never do this. Every hour do this. This is the most important thing. And you start making lists of that. Everything's hyperbolic. And I think that's interesting with religious material, because if you take all of that, superlative language, totally literalistic, it's rough.
Yeah, I've thought about with our own time period too. Like, even like the 80s, when you say everything that was good was bad. That's bad. That's bad. Like, how would that translate to people in the future who have no idea?
I think I feel.
Yeah. It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the text, let's get at it. How about that? Psalm 90. This is a Psalm of Moses, and I'm wondering if Brandy would pray for us, and then, I don't know, Katie, would you read the text for us? It's not so long. Why don't we read the text, and then we'll dive into it.
Loving Father, thank you for each of us that are able to be here this morning. Please be with those that are far and distant or unable to join. We pray your Holy Spirit would just be among each one of us in our minds and our hearts, in our breathing, as some people are in hazardous breathing areas and dealing with wildfires. God, we just pray that you'd be with them as well. Be close to them. May they find rest and comfort and nourishment and safety in you today. And may you continually be with all of that is happening right now, as you are with us at the same time, because you're able to do that. You're amazing. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, Psalms 90. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You return man to dust, and say, Return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands.
We've talked before in this group about how all Scripture is a mountain range, but some in a mountain range, some peaks are higher than others, and this feels like that to me. This is one of those parts of Scripture that feels like it's higher elevation. It speaks to some pretty deep things. So let me just a couple things on my head, and let me throw a question out to you guys. First of all, this is about mortality. This is a reflective psalm of Moses, and there's no waffling on a conversation about the brevity of life, the reality of death. For different parts of history and different places around the globe, the numbers would change. In our pre-conversation today, we were talking about 150 years ago. Life expectancy was around 41 in the United States, for example. And even if you account for death in infancy, kind of infant mortality issues, it wouldn't even be much higher than that. By our day, and the last few decades, at least in America, 79. So you have this huge surge of life expectancy. And if you live a healthy life, on average, you add a decade to that. You know, what we mean by a healthy life, but, you know, some basic principles, which would put you up near 90. Although in the last, I think it's 2 to 3 years, principally because of mental health issues, that there's been a decline in that statistic by a few months, kind of backing off a little bit. But whether you're talking about 41 or 79 or 89 or 99, you're talking about brevity. So that's one thing I think, just to set the context, is the whole feel of this psalm. This is a mature psalm. This is a serious conversation. And then the last lines to me are interesting. If there's something hopeful, it's given this reality, establish the work of our lives. You know, give us some strength in how we think about our labor for the period of time that we're on this earth. Even though it's short, we need a way of thinking about it. So God, help us to establish that in our souls. And of course, Moses has three interesting if you take the 120 years, which is basically the lifespan that we read about in the life of Moses, it's interesting because there's 40 years where he looks at labor, and labor is slavery. So the first 40 years he's looking at labor as slavery, which is interesting given this passage. The middle 40 years is labor in obscurity. So he's out in the wilderness for those middle 40, just chasing around, looking at bushes to see if they're burning, right? I mean, he didn't have a lot going on, which is interesting. So labor that's kind of not celebrated, which we could relate to. So if the first is labor that's abusive, the second third is labor that's kind of obscure, and the last is in a leadership position, leadership of people who don't want to go anywhere. Who are complaining about the quality of the corporate cafeteria, and the AC's broken, and we're going the wrong way, and this is useless. So he has these really three interesting perspectives on work. I think that's interesting as a backdrop to this because of those three. It all kind of divides up really nicely. So. So let me just throw those ideas out for our consideration, and maybe just ask a first question about how do you think in your area of the world where you are, and all of us are kind of in the Western world on this conversation, but what do people think about life and death, the brevity of life? What are people's attitudes or experience? Like, how would they react to this? Is mortality something we try to forget about? Is it on people's minds? The events of 2020, has that changed the way that we think about mortality as a society? Let me just kind of throw those questions out and kind of do an exegesis both of the text and society.
From what I have experienced and seen in my area of life, but particularly in the hospital settings, and actually in culture and everything, is an obsession with life, like a resistance to the idea that we are mortal, that we are going to die, and I think that to the point where quantity of life is more valuable than quality of life, to the point where we will do things that maybe we'll prioritize things differently based on how we value that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that we were created by God to live. We were not created by God to die. And I think that is core within our being. I think that we were created to live eternally with him. Like, that's how he made us. We were supposed to, sin wasn't supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to do that. So there's something in us that knows that death is broken, that death is not how we are supposed to be. And so I think that it's easy to gravitate toward that as like one of the highest priorities, preserve life at all costs. And yet this psalm helps us to go back to our mortality and remember who God is and what he's doing in the universe from a wider perspective, that we may come and we may go, but in the end, it's in his hands, and our mortality even is secure within him. And so we don't have to make that our biggest thing that we try to preserve, because that can go backwards. And I've seen it go backwards, and it's not good for people. There's a time to live and there's a time to die. Anyway.
Excellent. Japhet, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking that if I were Adam and Eve, I think I'd feel differently about life. And I think that after sin, I think it's the one thing that we have no control over. And I'm with Brandy, like that's actually, it's counter to everything we are. and yet we have no control over it. And it is the one thing that God says he actually has the power to overcome, right? So I think that I look at this psalm here, 90, as just this incredible, beautiful, powerful call to humanity that doesn't actually think about death until something terrible happens. I don't think we think about death often enough, unless we're getting older or something's happening in our lives that makes us suddenly realize that we're fragile. And otherwise we actually kind of like push it all aside, in my opinion.
Tommy and I just read when we were on our little weekend getaway to North Georgia, The Lost Art of Dying. And it's kind of the Memoria Mori, or whatever, the Ars Moriendi, that Joe Darby is one of the ones that drew my attention to this. It's a medieval kind of way of thinking about dying, and she's got that in her art in a lot of ways, like always has something that's death in her paintings, that represents a little bit of things that are dying. And so this book was really helpful. It was written by a physician, and I had gone to a Zoom meeting for Christian academics at which she was speaking, and so they gave us this book kind of for free for participating in that. And then I'm also reading about dementia, a book on living in the memories of God, about dementia. So both of these in the last 2 weeks that I've been reading have just really been speaking about this kind of thing to me, in terms of what you brought up, Alex, like we don't want to die. And I think that when I read this in Psalm 90, I see, yes, this is a group where people did die. This is a time period people died young, but they don't want to, and we want to live, and we want to live kind of as who we are. But yes, Lewis has just said something that I was thinking when I read it. When I was looking ahead to Psalm 90, it was like, this is written by Moses. If we think about him writing it in some sort of literal fashion, it seems to be reflecting on the time in the wilderness with the Israelites and kind of some of their experience. And for a people, so as a historian, part of what, and this is where memory is really interesting and important, and some of the stuff that I'm reading about this theologian on dementia is instructive to me as a historian, because how we remember things and thinking about how we're going to be remembered and how our work is going to be remembered in the future, and kind of where we're going, is part of what gives us meaning and value. We want to be like, my work is going to carry on after me, and I'm going to do something that's sort of a legacy. And it feels like this psalm is talking to a people for whom that may not always be. I don't know if humans have always felt that way or not. I don't know how much of that is modern. I don't know how much of that is, honestly, and I'd be interested in hearing other people's ideas. But I do think this seems like Moses is helping the people sing, if they're going to sing with this song, in a way that gives their lives greater meaning, puts them in the context of, and even teaching us to number our days. For me, it's like, I'm not going to live very long. But for them, maybe it was more like, actually, yeah, even though you're not living very long, you're actually going to be living longer, kind of in the value, and because he's tying them into the bigger story, it's giving greater value to what they have. Whereas what I need to do is put myself in the bigger story and maybe become less of a legend in my own mind and more like a smaller piece of the greater good that's going on.
Katie, what are you thinking?
I think when you think about death, it just reminds you of that bigger picture. And I feel like it's hard for us to think about that, because that makes us think about like other things. Like, so if a person says, if I were to die, would my family be taken care of? Or where am I at spiritually? Or it goes a little bit deeper than just the actual idea of dying. And so I think it's hard for society to think about it and talk about it sometimes, because it's kind of the surface of what could be a lot of deeper things that people are going through. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
No, it does. And I think that there's some reflection that, for example, the self-esteem movement of the last several decades has actually hurt people's self-esteem, because it kind of has just been, it's been fluffy, like everybody's good. Well, what if you kind of know in your gut you're not? How do you deal with that? And that goes really to last week's discussion about sin. And I think the same thing applies here, is that maybe in order to live a healthy life, you have to first have a healthy view of death. Otherwise, you're just kind of running from it, and you end up kind of not having stable ground. I'm interested, and I'll throw this out as well. The psalm begins with kind of by framing this whole heavy conversation in the fact that God is the dwelling place for all generations. So in other words, this whole conversation is taking place inside the geography of God. So the living that you're doing, the dying that you're doing, is happening inside the house of God, if you will. It's inside God's house. It's inside God's arms. And I'm wondering, what difference does that make, that understanding?
Well, Tulio wrote that, like, this might not this be a hint from God through Moses to tell us that he has us and our loved ones covered when we're no longer around. Like, again, the perspective of where we're fitting in, the countless generations, like before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world. I've heard some people talk about, part of, like, writing ourselves into God's story is part of our witness, is part of our self-understanding, finding ourselves as part of the greater story that God is doing in the world. And it feels a little bit like Moses is doing that for them.
Yeah, even the language in verse 2 of everlasting to everlasting, that's almost like an infinite line moving in both directions, right? So deep into the historical past, just, and then deep into the future. It is, Lisa, right? I mean, I think it is, it's trying to put your life in context. In a way, and I think that's what ties into the last verses, in a way that makes your work in this world feel meaningful. What else?
I read something this week that was talking about how this dwelling place language was applying to both Moses and Israel, because it was talking about the different phases that Moses went through. And then Israel didn't have a land, and Moses, was a fugitive at one point. And so what it was saying was, the dwelling place is the presence of God. And so it reminded me of the saying, like people say, like, oh, home is where, like, my family is, or something like that. It made me think about how maybe our dwelling place is that presence with God. And no matter where we are geographically, when we're in that presence of God, that's where we live. That's where we dwell with him.
Yeah, I like that a lot, actually.
Good.
I think that when I looked at this passage again, I saw that Moses, I'm a believer that Moses wrote also the book of Job. And so I saw that Moses gives a cross-reference or nuances to, that early writing of Job. He also gives references in Deuteronomy as well to this dwelling ability, where he describes it in so many different ways. Like it's isolation, it's protection, it's a den for animals. It's all this kind of like, it's a sanctuary. And I think that what God is doing through Moses really is to say to us that, look, no matter where you see yourself, and children of Israel, whether they were in slavery or whether they were out at this point, no matter where you see yourself, there is this other perspective of looking at who God is in our life. And so I wonder if that's actually the call to it, rather than death provides meaning for everything that we do. Because I think that,
yeah, I like that. I like that, Jay.
Eternity is difficult, right, for us to really get excited about sometimes, right? Like, I'm going to live forever.
Yeah, it's interesting. No, that's right. Brandy, I want to put a question to you. And by the way, beloved audience, we don't map any of this out. So when I say I'm putting a question to you, Brandy's going, "Oh my goodness, what's happening next?" The next
and we're
verse
glad you're asking Brandy.
Yeah. The next verse is interesting, where it says that God turns people back to dust. In other words, Moses is putting in God's hands the process of the return to dust, which is interesting. That God is actually the one that's helping to navigate our passage to death. I don't want to say that he's killing us, because I think, but there's a proactive role that God is playing in that off-ramp process from this life. So my question to you is, what do you make of that?
Well, so just looking at the passage, even when it talks about the morning grass, how it sprouts anew in verse 5, and the morning it flourishes and it sprouts anew in verse 6, and then it fades and it withers away. Like, I see that when sin entered the world, then death entered the world, and there became life cycles. And that's part of animal kingdom. It's part of plants. It's part of humans. And that, to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is causative to our death, but that it's a process that's going to happen. And yet I love that it says in the morning it sprouts anew. So like, it can die at night and then it can sprout anew. Like, he also has the ability to breathe back into that dust and recreate us back into new creatures, which is what he's promised to do. So there's this life cycle that isn't necessarily permanent, but it can be permanent. It's all in his breath and in his hands, like it was at the creation of time. And along with that, like talking about the thousands of years, I can't help whenever I think about that, to think about the fact that God is not linear in his time. Like, it is on our planet that we have 7 days a week and, 28 to 30 days a month. The way that our earth spins on its axis and rotates around the sun determines our time. And that's not universal. That's actually earth. And so we number our days, we number our years, but he's got this whole big thing of time. And we are so significant. He knows every hair on our head. And yet we are also part of this cycle. There, we can grab onto that, and we are mortal, and we will become dust, and then he will make us anew. So that's my perspective.
I like that.
It also seems.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Go ahead, Jay.
No, you're wearing the really cool, bandana pirate thing. You should go ahead.
I'm dangerous.
Yeah.
I feel like this is like the life cycle is here, and also it's the kind of thing. It is sort of the kind of wisdom. It could be a reflection on the specific moment Moses is in, with his people. Also, it seems like the kind of thing you hear from people as they progress through life, and it's kind of like, here's who we are before God, and sometimes life sucks, and things are bad, and we have to pray for God to kind of help us out. But also, he gives us amazing things, and life is joyful, and he stretches it out, and he makes our life meaningful. And it's kind of this reflections on sort of how to think about what Brandy said, kind of the cycles of life, or the arc of life, for oneself and for one's people. So I don't know, that's kind of part of what I'm looking at. I just see sort of the wisdom there of a long life that says, yep, and you got to talk back to God and say, please rescue us, and why are you doing this, and you're mad at, just those sort of things.
Now, Lisa, I'm going to push back, and then I know Jay wanted to weigh in. I want to push back on something you said. Moses is not quite as bullish on life as you are. He says the best of our days is nothing but trouble. That's what it says in the text. The best of our days is nothing but trouble. Is this just one of the Psalms that is authentically morose, which is part of the richness of the Psalms? Or I'll just put the same question as I put to Brandy. What do you make of that?
Well, the verses 14 to 17 are where and even verse 12 in there, I think are requests. Maybe they aren't reflections on also life is wonderful, but they are requests to God. Him speaking like, have compassion on us, make us glad for as many days as you've afflicted us. Like, help us to have joy as well as sorrow, and to know that you're part of both of that. Have compassion, gain a heart of wisdom. May your splendor be shown to us. May the favor of our God rest on us, establish the work of our hands. And I guess I wasn't only thinking of that as a demand from God from a position of it's terrible down here, for crying out loud. Would you at least establish the work of our hands and make our days? It could be that, but also it seems like the kind of thing where you're like, this is what you ask for. And it seems to me, and I know that's the reader I am, hopeful and optimistic that he thinks God might answer that prayer that way, you know, and that then you have that. But Jay still hasn't gotten to speak. See what happens, Jay, when you're nice?
No, I'm going to come back to the point in a second, but I want to respond to what you're saying right now, because I think you're talking about a fellow, you know, Moses, who had a face-to-face encounter with God, who went to a secret den, a cave, the same cave that Elijah went to when he was in crisis as well, you know, to hear the voice of God. So we have a person who's really has this intimate relationship with God, this connection with him, and his encounter with God is that I'm not running away from death. I'm asking God just to help me inside my life to do all that you've called me to do. That's what I see the Psalm 90. That's why when it gets to the end of Moses' life, the writers talk about him being unabated. You know, he's still strength, he's still capable. He's not like, there's a timing thing, connection with God that's different from Moses, that he has this thing that says, let me just live in wisdom through the pain, through the good, through the beautiful, through the hard, but do not diminish, you know, this thing. And that's what I think he's seeing inside here, which is a different perspective. It's not what we think about death, like Brandy was saying earlier. You know, it's like we're constantly battling to live a little bit longer and have less. We were talking about this just before we got online about, you know, less pains in our bodies and aches and stuff. But I think that's important as well. But the other thing that I was thinking of is that I have a friend of mine who's a physicist who was talking about time, and he said to me that he kind of conceives it as this long line, eternity past, eternity forward, and there's a dot in there where sin enters, and then we kind of like have a bubble that just kind of comes out until we come back to that dot in that eternity of line, and we're living in that kind of like circle inside that dot, which is like a millisecond for God, but for us feels like eternity. And so God is like, it, you know, holding all of our time in a different sphere, if you like, to what eternity past and eternity future looks like. And I see a lot of beautiful hope inside that, like that God is the one who has it all.
Yeah, Jay, I go back to, I've said this publicly many times, but it's been helpful for me. The greatest struggle I have in my walk with God is not the existence of God. It's not the character of God. It's the why on earth are we still here in the mess? That's the single hardest thing for me. It's like, I don't understand as a parent, if you saw your kids suffer, you know, so what I'm going to say now doesn't really solve it, but it's a one way I think about it, which is, it's the day is 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. It's been 48 hours since God said that. If you took literally that day to 1,000 years, just as a way of thinking, that in Jesus' time, that's been about 48 hours, and somehow in humility, as painful as it is, I try to sort out that, like your physicist friend saying, that it's a different dimension, and again, that does not help when the fires are burning.
No.
Well, and Tulio wants us to talk about the wrath verses and not work on, you know, spend this hour not addressing the wrath verses.
Yeah, I think I want to do that as well, Lisa. I also think that the 70 is not just a literal number. There's something deep in the Bible about 70 and completeness that is different for every single person. But it is about God saying that there is a complete life. And we try to determine what that complete life looks like by living longer and longer, as much as we can, and as full of life as possible. But God says, I have a different picture of what I say is complete for you.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. Let me jump in on the wrath thing, and then I want to hear what.
Yeah.
I think that maybe instead of thinking of wrath as vindictiveness, which doesn't fit the character of God, that the point I just made, which is my struggle, is why are we still here? I'm wondering if the wrath is the reality that this mess goes on and it doesn't feel very good. And because God is alive right now, I can say to him, because he's listening, it doesn't feel very good to be down here right now. So
that's verse 13.
God, if you're listening, that's what we're saying. I think, it feels like your wrath, God, is what it feels like. I mean, I think that's the authentic. We don't really talk about that. We don't talk that way about God. And even to hear me say it out loud, it's not. But it's to go, God, right now, I'm not talking to the panel. I'm talking to you. We're kind of done. I think that that's part of what's going on here. It's It's saying, God, this does not. We're in that loop that Japhet described. Mm-hmm. And I think that we protest it and we don't let God off the hook. If that may, I think when we let God off the hook for how we feel, it creates an inauthentic relationship with God. And we try to kind of smooth it over with weird explanations that hurt people at funerals and make people walk away from church. Why don't we just admit it? We're kind of irritated, God, that we're still here. Now, we love you. We respect you. We're going to try to wrestle through that like Moses, but we're not going to remove those verses by saying, well, we're going to give some theological answer to this. No, we're kind of ticked off because it's not fun to be down here right now.
I like that, Alex, a lot. I think that every single human being, whether they believe in the God that we believe in or any other system they have, no matter who they are, we all long for meaning, right? And so what we do is and I think Dan Ferguson, online in the chat, he alluded to a book that kind of gives an idea of how death has actually shaped what that meaning actually is and creates tension inside this. I'm going to have to look that up. But I think we all long for meaning. And because we all long for meaning, I think we interpret our circumstances and the power around us. Hence, at Moses' time in Egypt at that time, all power was always, the nature around them they had no control over, or thunder and the power of the gods were always just up there at will doing crazy things. So then Moses comes along and they had this mountain experience, and God says, well, you people don't understand anything else. I will use the culture of the time and I will shake the earth and shake the mountain so you kind of feel like there is a God, there is something out of your control, right? And I think the language of wrath has actually been used unfortunately, by some people to allude that God is like angry in the sense of like he's emotionally out of control. He's like, all right, today I'm bringing this down, as opposed to the presence of who God is, that he is all powerful. And I lean to wrath being a symbol of God's presence, not God being fearful, but God actually saying, I actually am God. The universe does hang and rest on what I say, and so it's not the same kind of wrath that I may have when I'm driving and somebody cuts me up, which may happen.
Can I ask, Alex, if you're saying something? I'm saying this as a person with no theological training here in this
group of
5
Lisa.
people. No, I don't. And so I tried something I've never done last night at our part of our one of our modified senior retreat things. Where I tried to basically kind of give my testimony to my graduating seniors, like, why do I still believe? Like, I'm an Adventist and I'm a Christian because this is the faith I was raised in, both the Christianity, the Protestantism, and the Adventism of it. But why am I still here? Why do I stay, right? So the question isn't why did I become, but why am I still here? And I tried to do that in a smallish form, and I didn't do a very good job of it. And one of the things I did try to address in that small form is how I read the Bible. And part of what I hear you doing here, and I just want to clarify, is if it's okay, and I don't know, and I'm asking the theologians here, is it okay that one could read this? What I sensed when you saying is this is a song Moses wrote. Ellen White tells us, our faith tells us, the Bible is both human and divine, just like the incarnation is human and divine. It's the work of both. That Moses is saying something about God's wrath, which may or may not be accurate in the sense that maybe God is or isn't actually angry in any kind of sense that we understand that. But like you were just, what I heard you say, Alex, it kind of feels like this is anger. Like, seems like you're mad at us. What are you doing? Like, this is the human response isn't necessarily an accurate reflection of whether or not God is actually angry.
Yeah, and no. And the thing, Lisa, the thing is, when you look at these biographies in the scripture, and you've referenced Moses, but you go to Abraham, you go to, I would even argue Jesus to some degree. My God, why have you forsaken me? I don't think that we've allowed that in our tradition. And as again, I think as Protestants, with our apologetic approach, where we want to defend God we're afraid to have these authentic interchanges. One of the rabbinic traditions sorting out that most problematic of all biblical passages, in my view, is Abraham's of Isaac. Right, you know where I'm going. Is that the sin of Abraham was not pushing back on God? Now, I would say put that in your pipe and smoke it, but then we'd end up on some website saying that One Project type people are telling people to smoke. But put that in your pipe and smoke it, because if Abraham's sin was God was wanting him to wrestle, it's an interesting rabbinic interpretation of that problematic passage. And I think when you look at all the folks that see in the biblical record that seem to be men and women after God's own heart, there's not fear in wrestling with God. I think so. Sure, Lisa, there's going to be misunderstandings. So what exactly is it that we're pushing back on? But
we should be putting back on it. Like, whether it's actually, quote unquote, like people have said, is God's wrath is another manifestation of his love, like his discipline of us, like things like that. If that's what's going on, if that is an accurate description of what's going on, if it's all the other way of thinking of it is things that we think of, like Jay was talking about, the natural disasters and everything. And when we think about the arc of what God is doing, Alex, you said 48 hours since Jesus or whatever, that we don't know what the goodness is that God is working out through all of this yet, because it just hasn't been enough time in some sense, So there's that way of thinking about it. It's not really wrath. It's actually something that's healing. But it also could be, and I use a lot of parenting analogies, even though I don't think that's a great all the time, because parents are not perfect representations of God. But kids will be like, you're so mad at me. And the parents aren't actually mad at the kid. Like, this is just their... But of course, we should be given freedom to speak back. And I think that is part of what's going on here. I just was kind of wanting to clarify that that's how I think things are happening to people reading the Bible sometimes, where they're like, it's not that everything in the Bible is actually an accurate representation of what God was doing, but a lot of it is our responses to him. And that's our sacred text, to yell at God for treating us badly.
I think Lisa, you're absolutely spot on about like the text being authentic of the relationship and reality of what people are experiencing at that time, which is actually a clue as to how we should be living today, right? It's like not a clue, it's like a directive. If God says, look, I encourage all of these people to gather these stories together, and of all the stories that we could have gathered together, these ones, ugly, beautiful, were all pulled together, and yet it's inside there, so you can understand that I, God, am not afraid of your struggles, your reality, your interpretation of me, but the character of God will eventually be seen by the entire picture, which is the complexity of it. So we try to sanitize everything, and we try to make it like palatable for everybody straight away, without allowing anyone the process time that they need to say, yep. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to do in this pain. Somebody wrote a question inside here. I think it was Rod or Todd. No, Rod. I typed in Todd. Rod asked the question about, what is a 50-year-old person who is suffering in pain compared to like somebody who's 18, who's like doesn't really worry about that kind of pain? How do you deal with the picture of God inside those two places? And I think that's reality. Let me tell you this. One day I was sitting down with these two pastors. Actually, one of them is Zach, and the other one was Robert Surridge, who's passed away, and Zach Plantak, two young pastors at the time. I was much younger, and they were both having a conversation about church, right? And they were like at it, and I was like 19, like eating this up, and then they stopped, and they turned to each other and to me and said, no, we're going to stop. You shouldn't be hearing this stuff, Japhet. And I was like, no, I want to hear it. and I didn't understand at the time, but because their faith was strong, they could talk candidly about the church and the problems in the church and not be shaken by it, but they didn't want to affect me. And I think we've got to allow people, whatever age they're in, to process with God at the time and the moment that they're in, and not say, this is the only way to see God. You've got to grow through that.
I've got a thought about that, but I don't.
One of those. Yeah.
No, I want to pick up on that, but I don't know if Brandy or Katie want to weigh in. But I'll pick up on it, and then you guys jump in after that. I saw Rod's question, and I think it's one of the best questions we've had, I think, in our chats. I think it goes to the heart. I think that we haven't really entered Jesus into this conversation in terms of the gospel record, but there's two main themes in the Gospels. This is how I would answer that. I would begin to answer that question. One is you have Jesus, who's the suffering, the man who's suffering. Loads and loads of theology and reflection about what it means to suffer, knowing that he was going to die. I mean, the Gospel of John, which is Japhet's favorite, I mean, it's basically it's a walk to death. I mean, a lot of it is you can just see where it's going. So I think for the 50-year-old who's really wrestling with, with mortality, I think that Jesus gives us plenty to really think about. On the other hand, there's Jesus, the party animal, where it's like, why aren't your disciples fasting? Why are they not playing by the rules? Jesus, why are you not being more productive? You're constantly eating and drinking and goofing around, and you're very not productive. There's loads of that as well, where Jesus is just like, there's serious stuff to get to, but right now we're going to grill some fish. Fish and chips, over and over again. Thank you, Japhet. Yeah, I know you'd appreciate that. But but you also can read the Gospels through that lens, where Jesus is saying, no, we're not going to live the ascetic lifestyle. We're not going to just dive into the dark. There's a whole nother track of Scripture that says you got to learn how to live. And then there's another track that says you need to learn how to die. And I think that it's not just about age. Of course, Rod's just making the point that there's those two perspectives, because there could be 18-year-olds that need the suffering Christ, and there could be 50-year-olds that need to learn how to stop being so dang serious and learn to live a little bit and not live on the edge all the time. By the way, that might be something good for the rest of 2020, is everybody's so amped up on everything. How about a little fish and chips instead? That might be better. So I actually think that Christ, and I'll be quiet here, but I'm preaching at this point, but I think both are there in the gospel record, and both are definitely there in the incarnational story of Jesus. I mean, there's no question. So when I run upstairs after this to hang out with my kids, they kind of need the Jesus of the party from me. They don't need the Jesus of gloom and doom. But then there's others that need to sort out the gloom and the doom. So I'll be done. But I think both of those are there. They're not independent of one another, although I think they can be treated independent. I think there's cross sections, and I think that's the richness of the gospel stories. You get life and death.
I love that a lot.
Yep.
And I think that's what makes God God, right? That he understands.
And I think, anyway, go ahead, Katie.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that I also heard something regarding this about how this psalm it's comparing God and man, but it's magnifying God. And so what the insight was saying is when you magnify something, you bring it closer, you give a better picture. And so one thing I was thinking about with this psalm is through it, Moses is magnifying God, giving a better picture of who God is. And that includes this cycle, that includes holding that time, that what Japhet was saying, the illustration about sin, it includes him holding that, but it also includes what you were saying, Alex, about those two different natures and how that's what God is. And so I was kind of thinking about with this, and could it be that God is being magnified in a way that includes all of that? It's not just God, we're really mad, or, like fish and chips. I think it brings God a little bit closer and makes him a little bit more relevant to what's going on down here.
Good.
I like that a lot.
Yes, thank you, Katie. I was looking at verse 11 with who understands the power of your anger. And I think that's kind of like what I hear is like, who understands God's anger? Like it's really a lot deeper, and because who understands an anger that comes from a place of love? Like who understands and what we're perceiving as anger? Because that's the 18-year-old, the 50-year-old, it's the how we live and how we die. Like it all kind of goes back to how we're perceiving it, because we're always going to think about, like I may think somebody seems more angry than they are, based on my history. If maybe I had an angry father, and so I'm triggered by things, and that happens more and more depending on whatever our historical backgrounds are, what we've experienced and what we've seen. And so it's easy to attribute things to God that necessarily might not be there, might not be the motivation, and might have many more deeper layers and be so much more complicated because he's not in our emotions. Like, we are so, like, we have anger, happy, sad, like these type of emotions that we've learned to name, and that's good and healthy for us. But God is way more emotionally healthy than we are. Like, he has so much more complexity in that comes from a place of love, ultimately, because that's who he is. So it can't come from another place. And so I think whenever what I see is him saying, who understands this, to teach us to number our days, that we may present a heart of wisdom. Help us to understand what to do with these things, because I don't know, I don't know. Help me to learn how to be wise, and to navigate love well within this dynamic of brokenness that I don't know what to do with.
I think that's excellent, Brandy, because I think those are the kind of questions that only come out of a person like Moses, who understood what it means to be lost, what it means to be unsure of what the future is, what it means to be in a place of like despair or no hope. And I think that's why we often go to the Second Testament, because we feel like that's the place where it's going to give us text to give us courage and hope. But I think the first 5 books, the Bible, I think that they have so much richness of the narrative of stories about identity, about who we are and who God is, that just it allows us to process so much more. And I think we miss that strength inside that. I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I just posted in the chat for those that are reading it, a book that I hadn't read in about, I don't know, a couple decades, that I just pulled back and started reading, The Bible Jesus Read by Philip Yancey.
Yeah.
It's really a nice reflection on some of this, Japhet, that you were mentioning there.
Well,
and kind of pulling
Alex, isn't that the whole story of the road to Emmaus, that God is able to, in that, with I personally believe aunt and uncle, but that's another day for it. But in that moment, he's able to tell them from the First Testament the entire gospel, because that was the Bible, that was the thing that he read and understood, and I love that too. I'm with you, Alex.
Man, our hour went quick.
Yeah, and there's so much still left in this psalm.
So much.
Yeah.
I think it's Japhet talking so long. No, I'm just teasing. It's probably me talking. Hey. Let me finish with it. Let me finish with this, then we'll pray and we'll keep talking for fun. But I don't remember where I was driving recently, but I can't remember what trip it was. But it was one of those scenes where you have like a little, not a country church, but a little old church, right? A little church kind of up on a hill, kind of that idyllic setting. And on one side, there was a playground. It looked like maybe a daycare. So there was playground equipment on the one side of the church. You could visualize that. So, and then on the other side of the church was
cemetery.
And I think that that's the richness of Christian theology in an image. I think that's the richness of why Jesus is superior in his revelation, and when he talks about living an abundant life. I think that's the whole picture, and the ability to, and I think that's where the psalm is heading. The ability to establish the work of life, to live it well, is to have both the playground and the cemetery, and to be able to figure that out. And to lean into that. And I think that's, I looked at that and I thought, that's it. That's the imagery of where we're headed, I think. So.
I love that.
Father in heaven, thank you for this hour, for the richness of the Psalms. We've enjoyed it the last many weeks as we have tried to learn from you. I pray that we would both know how to cry and how to laugh in this world, even in the incredible darkness of the present moment, may we understand how to do both well, and be with us, I pray, in Jesus' name, amen. So before we find out what Rosie the Riveter is doing this afternoon, Japhet, I think a word and maybe a link in the chat to a special event that's coming this October is in order. So could you speak to that, and also how people can connect to it, just maybe in 45 seconds or so, give them a sense of what that is?
Yeah. So I just put the link inside there. It's to our gathering that's coming together in October, and you can read all about it on that webpage. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us. But it is really, I think it's really apropos for what we're going through today in this time, this year 2020. How do you stay the course? And Alex, the one who actually, chose the title for this and the passages, and I think the passage Matthew 24 is just so strong, and so I think it'll be a really great gathering for us. We're going to do it online. We're going to do it in multiple time zones, and so it'll be amazing.
2 days, multiple time zones, one project gathering, and we're going to look at the first 10, 11 verses of Matthew 24, and the year 2020. Read Matthew 24. It looks exactly like it's a prediction of 2020. So we're going to see where we go with all of that. But would love to have you, and would love for you to grab a group if the social distancing is appropriate with where we need to be health-wise. Grab a group in your living room or on your back porch and subscribe. But that should be a lot of fun, and I think a meaningful experience. Also, just one more word, and then we'll do a little fun chat here. Continue to thank you for those that are just contributing a little bit every month to Saltworks. It really helps this technology, and continuing to do it well. It does cost a little something. So if that's something in your spirit after you've taken care of your local church that you'd be willing to do, it really helps us keep this going and to continue to think about ways to expand it so it ministers to more people. It'd be great. So thank you. All right. We've been doing east to west, north to south, south to north. Maybe we could do worst air quality to best air quality today. I don't know. That'd be kind of dark to do that. So let's see. We could do, I don't know. We got to do, what are you going to do this afternoon? And the most memorable or best meal you've had in the last, I don't know, I'll give you a big span, 5 years. Give you plenty of time to think about some. You just really eat some. Japhet's going, his mind's blowing up. There's been so many there's so many candidates for this. I don't know what to do.
No, I don't know. Which day?
Yeah. So, Japhet, you get to go first. I'll let you go first, though. So what are you doing this afternoon? And a meal that's been just really good.
Yeah, I am. I'm going to be working on my new Lego car, and I'm going to also be working on a sermon. And so both those things with family, with myself, and so it'll be a great Sabbath afternoon. Best meal in the last 5 years, that's really hard. I mean, I think for me, a meal is all about who's at the table. And so it would just be about the memory of the conversations took place. And I would say that would be really hard to narrow down to just one meal. I do not like the Last Supper. I'm all about many. So I can't mention it. Just every single one has been about the conversations.
What are you doing this afternoon?
Lego and sermon.
Yeah, sure. You got me going on the food, and my mind was just.
I know.
Trailing right into that. So, Katie, what do you? How do you answer those two questions?
So what I'm doing today, I think we're seeing family members. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, so we'll see. Not going outside, obviously. And then best meal. I don't think I can narrow that down, but I think I can say the month that I spent traveling in the Middle East and eating Middle Eastern food all day, that was a pretty good month. So any meal in that time.
Nice. Yeah, don't go outside. It's crazy. Brandy.
Yes. So this afternoon, we're gonna go snorkeling in the North Shore, grab a picnic, and go. And right now we can be in the water with the kids, but if we're on the beach, we have to be by ourselves. So I don't know why.
Wait a minute. By yourself on a beach?
I know.
Hey.
It's mandated by the law.
That sounded pretty good.
Yeah. So, yeah, somebody with kids, somebody on the beach. Swap.
Wow.
So we'll be snorkeling away at Sharks Cove. Yay. And then most memorable meal, I do have a food thing. There's this food truck actually on the North Shore called Elephant Shack. And they have the most amazing pad thai ever in the history of life. And I'm a Thai food fanatic and I love it. And pad thai is not usually my favorite thing at Thai food, but Elephant Shack, I can eat that forever, every day. It's the best.
Lisa.
Yeah, so I have some Sabbath justice work to do this afternoon. I'm with a group of people that are trying to get the Confederate monument on our courthouse lawn taken down. So we're working on our presentations to the county commission. And so I'm going to be doing some reflecting on that. And then I also am this week, we're having our Constitution Day celebrations on campus, and it's 100 years since women got the right to vote. And so I and some of my students from our women's history class last semester. Oh yeah. Boo. Oh, okay. So since women got the right to vote in the United States of America, some women in Saudi Arabia only got the right to vote a couple years ago. Some women in Switzerland only got the right to vote in the 1990s. So women in New Zealand got the right to vote. Yeah, some cantons in Switzerland are super conservative, and women in Switzerland in general didn't get the right to vote till after World War II. But some cantons it was much later, including in the.
But they have such great chocolate.
I know, it's terrible how like some people can be terrible at one thing and good at something else. In terms of food, so that I was just going to say, I'll be also reflecting a little bit on what I'm thinking about with women voting and what I want to share with the students on campus. But for food, I just had to go ahead and narrow it to this past week, Alex, because then it does get a little complicated. For me, good food is almost anything I did not have to make. So I don't get to go out to eat as often as I probably should, given my vending machine eating habits. And I tend to not make good food for myself. Although this week I'm still eating. I got some really good sourdough bread from Need Love's Bakery on the south side, and I'm eating my tomatoes, the last of my tomatoes on my tomato plants, on that really good sourdough bread. And so that's the good stuff for me right now. Yeah.
Man, you threw so much conversation bait out there. I'm like just trying to resist. When was the Confederate monument erected that you're trying to take down?
Yeah.
When?
It was 1910. So right around the time we were lynching Black Chattanoogans. Right. Within a few years on either side of that, daughters of the Confederacy, the Daughters of the Confederacy, were part of that. And so there's a retired math professor from UTC who's organizing people to like carefully go about doing this in terms of our presentations to the city council. There's a professor, an art professor at Lee University, the Christian university that's about 45 minutes up the road from Southern, and Cleveland, Tennessee, where they are, has a huge Confederate monument. And he has a really clever idea for putting it inside like a capsule that you could go in, but in order to go inside it, you have to read a whole bunch of kind of information and context building. Like it's a really clever and artistic idea for how to add context. So anyway, it's I don't know exactly how we have 3 minutes before the county commission, and Betsy, who's the retired math professor, is collecting all of our kind of 3-minute content to sort of decide how to put it together. And so that's part of what I'm working on. Tomorrow we'll get together and go, okay, strategically, how do we organize these? So.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So, like Katie Wagner, we're going to be like, we can't go outside. If you're not from this area or in one of these areas, it's horrible. Like, it's literally, I took some stuff to the trash last night and you can't even get to like, I was outside maybe 15 or 20 seconds and you really shouldn't even take a breath. It's that bad. Oh. It's like being at a campfire everywhere. Just, it's incredible. So, yes, I went out and got filters all over the house right now to try to, and overnight I built one of these weird, box fan with just put a filter up against it. It's amazing how much dirt is already on it. And then, anyway, so I would love to be on the beach in Hawaii, not paying attention to my kids as they were just running around doing whatever. That sounds really good. Man, I've had so many good meals. I probably mentioned this before, but I don't know if she's listening, but my next door neighbor, Joanne Wiggins, for my Christmas present every year, because they're like family next door. So every year she gives me the same thing, but she always dresses it up differently with a metaphor. Like it could be like a necktie, or it could be it's always something with the word tie in it. And of course it's because she's a master tie chef. So so the present is always you, but I have not cashed in, if I can use that phrase. I have not cashed in this year yet because of COVID on the Thai meal. So, but this is like, I literally don't eat the day before hardly at all because I want to be a vending machine glutton at this feast. So I just, so I'm looking forward to COVID breaking because, because it's starting to sound good. When Brandy mentioned Thai, I started to think about that. And then
there's nothing like that kind of good food. Someone who can make it really well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, interesting, Lisa. 100 years since suffrage. It's interesting. And it wasn't even really until the 1990s with Clinton that you even had any real interest at women in the in a presidential cabinet. By the way, I was just reading about that. I mean, so you're talking about. Wow.
Right. It's not like just having suffrage doesn't mean equality or complete participation or integration. And so that's a different issue. So I'm having a panel of my students who we read, and Jan pointed out that we have to center Black women who did not get the right to vote until the 60s. And whose work was often eschewed because in Tennessee, we're the last place that voted for that amendment that gave women the right to vote, and the debate was so incredibly racist. Like I read a book on it just leading up to my women's suffrage class. It was so painful to read because they basically people were like, we would let women vote, but then you have all these Black women voting, and basically the white women just threw the Black women under the bus in terms of saying, you want us, we will be voting, and we're a vote for white women, Southern womanhood. If you let us vote, we promise to promote this. Anyway, and so that's a real issue, and when I was part of the Mayor's Council on Women here in Chattanooga for a few years, we were tasked with putting up a monument to the suffragettes because, again, Tennessee was the final state that did that. So it's a very dramatic, really super fun story where the youngest 24-year-old state representative in the state comes into, he doesn't know which way he's going to vote. They have red and yellow roses depending on which way they're going to vote. He actually has a red vote, which is not the anti-suffrage, and his people that he represented did not want women to vote. But his mom was really well educated and thought women should vote, and she wrote him a letter that he had in his pocket on the morning of the voting, and she was like, do the right thing, be a good boy, and he's the swing vote in Tennessee. So it's a rather dramatic story. It's quite fun. But yeah.
I remember, Japhet, you can shut this up when you need. Usually want to shut it down.
Bye.
But I remember as a kid growing up, some controversy in North Carolina about that couples were allowed to go into the voting booth. There'd be a little curtain together, and there was I remember, I can't remember all the details, but I remember there was concern because basically the story was that men would go in and basically tell their wives how to vote was the idea.
Right.
And so they had the right to vote, but did they? And I can remember that conversation about should the law be that you can't that two people can't go in the voting booth at the same time. And I don't. Again, my memory is imperfect about what was going on, but I can remember that conversation. But
well, I mean, it's not been that long since there were arguments about that. I mean, the arguments against women being able to vote are the same arguments against women's full equality and participation today. Like, and when I have my students in my World Societies class look at the anti-suffrage arguments, it's really funny because all of the arguments against women's full equality and participation in life are exactly the same. It's just where they're going to draw the line. So like, the same arguments that they're using for against women voting are the same ones where people today are like, well, women shouldn't be allowed to serve in combat units, or women, shouldn't be, there shouldn't be kind of affirmative action for women, or they shouldn't be ordained, or they shouldn't, like, there's a whole bunch of these, or I don't want to hire women because they might become mothers, they'll get married. The arguments are exactly the same. It's just where you're going to draw the line. Like nowadays, people rarely will say, oh, but women shouldn't vote. And so, oh yeah, somebody was talking about the monument. I was going to say about the women's monument, one of my friends who studies suffrage history was like, please don't put up a monument to the suffragettes that has black and white suffragettes like holding hands, kumbaya, like this was some sort of, like there wasn't like real racism going on in the suffrage movement. And so that's part of the challenge with any kind of monuments, is because they're not very nuanced. Monuments are not nuanced. And that's why historians are almost never in the business of putting up monuments. Like, we're often consulted with it, but it's like too much nuance. We always want to complicate things, and a monument doesn't complicate things enough for us. So, but anyway, yeah, that was multiple things I was trying to cover in one fast comment.
I took the bait. See what I did? Yeah. I just let it through some
I've totally watched Mrs. America. Jamie said Mrs. America. Of course, I signed it to my students at the end because we took the women's suffrage and women's rights movement up through the 70s. And so it's a really great, Mrs. America is a really great, it took it into the 80s. So anyway, yeah.
All right. Well,
happy Sabbathing, everyone.
Blessings to everybody in step forward in good faith today, and have a really amazing Sabbath.
Yeah. Right. Oh my goodness.
Take care.